always started the
Please!
same way.
They have...
Terminal C of
They have my daughter!
fluorescent lights humming overhead like dying insects. Rachel stood by the window sunset, bleeding orange and red across the tarmac, her carry-on at her feet, phone in her hand, checking his flight status for the third time in 10 minutes. Keith could see her from across the concourse, could see the way she tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, the nervous habit she'd never broken in 12 years of marriage. He tried to run toward her, tried to call out, but his legs moved through invisible mud, his voice caught in his throat like a stone. She looked up, smiled. That smile that had saved him more times than any body armor, more times than any extraction team. The smile that told him he was home, he was safe, he was loved, despite everything he'd done in 17 countries, whose names she'd never been allowed to know. Then the terminal twisted. Walls became hospital corridors. Fluorescent lights became heart monitors. Rachel's smile flickered like a bulb about to die. The beeping started steady at first, then erratic. Her hand reached for his across white sheets,
Please!
but he couldn't move,
They have...
couldn't close
They
that
have my
funnel.
daughter!
The flatline scream cut through everything, a sound that had become the soundtrack to 3 years of nights. Keith Brennan woke at 2:11 in the morning, heart slamming against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Sweat soaked through his t-shirt. The sheets tangled around his legs felt like restraints. For 3 seconds, he didn't know where he was. Syria, Afghanistan. The hospital room where Rachel had died while he was 30,000 feet over the Atlantic, racing home too late. Then Holly's breathing reached him from across the hall. Soft, steady, real. The sound pulled him back to Portland, to the small house on Everett Street, with its leaky faucet and creaking floorboards. To the life he'd built from the wreckage. He sat up, pressed palms to his eyes. The nightmare fragments clung like cobwebs. Rachel at the airport, Rachel in the hospital bed. The doctors explaining that the drunk driver had run the red light at 60 miles per hour, that Rachel's car had crumpled like paper, that she'd held on for 6 hours,
They have...
waiting for Keith
They
to
have my
arrive,
daughter!
waiting for him to make it home just one more time. He hadn't made it. The clock on his nightstand glowed 2:13. 4 hours until he had to wake Holly for school. 4 hours to pretend he was the father she deserved instead of the ghost of a man who'd traded 20 years of violence for a toolbox and a broken promise to never pick up a weapon again. Keith stood joints popping. 38 years old and his body felt 50. The insurgent's knife in Kabul had left him with a shoulder that ached before rain. The IED in Helmand had cracked 3 ribs that never quite healed right. Scars mapped his torso like a battlefield atlas, each one a memory he tried to bury under civilian clothes and Sunday morning pancakes. He walked to the window. Everett Street stretched empty under streetlights, houses dark Portland asleep. 3 years ago, he'd stood at another window in another city, looking out at the Mediterranean and wondering if Rachel would still recognize him when he came home, if Holly would remember him as anything other than the man in the photograph she kept by her bed. The questions had become pointless on a Tuesday in March when his commanding officer had found him in the team room, cleaning his weapons after a 40-hour op. The look on Commander Harris's face had told Keith everything before the words came out. "There's been an accident. Your wife. We have a plane ready." Keith had made it to Portland General Hospital 20 minutes after Rachel died. 20 minutes too late to say goodbye, too late to tell her he was done, that this deployment was his last, that he'd finally chosen her and Holly over the teams. 20 minutes too late to keep the promise he'd made the day Holly was born. The guilt was a living thing in his chest, feeding on every quiet moment. The knock came at 2:17. 3 sharp raps that shouldn't have sounded like gunfire, but did. Keith's training kicked in before conscious thought. His hand moved to his hip, where his sidearm used to ride. Found nothing. Right. Civilian now. No weapon, no threat. Just someone at the door in the middle of the night, which meant emergency or mistake. He moved through the house in bare feet, avoiding the floorboard that creaked near Holly's door. The nightlight in the bathroom cast Mickey Mouse shadows on the hallway wall. Holly's door was cracked open the way she liked it. Not quite closed, but not quite exposed. Keith paused, listened to her breathing. Still asleep. Still safe. The knocking came again. More urgent this time. Desperate. Keith reached the front door, hand on the knob, and stopped. Every instinct from 20 years of night rage screamed at him to assess before opening. Unknown hostile at your door at 0217 hours was never good news. He looked through the peephole. A woman, mid-30s, dark hair plastered to her skull with sweat or rain. But it wasn't raining. The left side of her face was swollen purple, spreading into black around her eye. Her lip had been split recently enough that blood still darkened the corner of her mouth. She wore a thin jacket over a tank top, arms wrapped around herself, shaking. Keith's jaw tightened. Domestic violence. He'd seen it before. The base had run training on how to handle it, how to help without making things worse. But those trainings always ended with, call the police, let the professionals handle it, don't get involved. The woman looked over her shoulder. The movement was pure prey animal checking for predators. Then she knocked again, harder, and pressed her face close to the door. Her words came out barely above a whisper, but Keith heard them through the wood. Please, I know you're there. I need help. They have my daughter. The words hit Keith like a fist. Daughter. He looked back toward Holly's room. Imagine someone taking her, hurting her, using her as leverage. The thought turned his blood to ice. He opened the door. The woman nearly collapsed against the frame. Up close, the damage was worse. The bruise around her eye was fresh, maybe an hour old. Capillaries had burst in the white of her eye, turning it red. Her lip wasn't just split, it was torn like someone had backhanded her with a ring. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Keith kept his body in the doorway, blocking entry, one foot braced against the inside frame. He'd learned the hard way that desperation made people unpredictable. The woman's eyes locked on his. They held a kind of terror Keith had only seen in war zones, the kind that came from knowing death was close and time was running out. Her voice cracked as the words tumbled out. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for coming here. I saw your truck in the driveway, the veteran plates. I thought maybe you'd understand. Maybe you'd help when no one else will. Keith said nothing. His mind was already running threat assessment. Woman injured, claiming her child was in danger. Could be legitimate, could be a setup, could be bait to draw him out. Taliban had used women and children as lures. So had cartels. So had pretty much every enemy he'd ever faced. The woman seemed to read his hesitation. She pulled in a shaking breath and spoke faster. My name is Veronica Hayes. My daughter is Zoe. She's 9 years old. 2 days ago, men grabbed us outside our apartment, threw us in a van. They've been keeping us separated, moving us around. Tonight I got away when one of them got careless with the door lock. But Zoe is still there. She's still with them. She's so scared. Keith's training told him to shut the door. His father's instinct told him to listen. Veronica's next words came out barely audible. They're traffickers. They're going to tell her. The words landed like a grenade. Keith had spent 18 months in Joint Special Operations Command going after trafficking networks in Southeast Asia. He'd seen the warehouses, the containers, the children. He knew exactly what happened to 9-year-old girls who got caught in that system. He knew with the kind of certainty that kept him awake at night. His hand tightened on the door frame until his knuckles went white. Veronica kept talking, words spilling out like she was afraid he'd close the door before she finished. I can't go to the police. They told me they have someone inside. I don't know who. If I call 911, they'll know. They'll move her or kill her. I don't have anyone else. I've been walking for an hour trying to find help. Then I saw your truck, the Navy SEAL emblem on your window. I thought maybe you'd know what to do. Maybe you'd help me get her back. Keith felt something cold settle in his chest. Navy SEAL, he hadn't been called that in 3 years. Not since he'd walked into Commander Harris's office the day after Rachel's funeral and put his trident on the desk. The Budweiser pin that marked him as part of an elite brotherhood that represented 6 months of hell in Coronado and 15 years of missions that would never be declassified. He'd left it there and walked away without looking back. The emblem on his truck window was the only piece of that life he'd kept. Holly had insisted. She'd been 5 years old standing in the parking lot of the car dealership pointing at the decal. Daddy, that's you. You have to get it so everyone knows you're a hero. He wasn't a hero. Heroes saved people. Keith had just been good at killing. Veronica was still talking. I know where they're keeping her. Old textile mill on Hancock Street by the river. They're moving her at 4 this morning. That's less than 2 hours from now. By the time the FBI mobilizes, she'll be gone. Please, I'm begging you. You know how to do this. You know how to get in and out without being seen. Keith's mind was already building the tactical picture. Textile mill meant multiple entry points, probably minimal security traffickers operating on the assumption that no one knew they were there. 2 hours meant tight timeline, no margin for error. Child hostage meant emotional complexity, higher chance of things going wrong. It was the kind of mission he'd run 100 times, the kind that got people killed when they went wrong. His voice came out rougher than he intended. You need to call the FBI. They have field offices that handle this. Trafficking is federal jurisdiction. Veronica's face crumpled. Tears cut tracks through the grime on her cheeks. There's no time. Don't you understand? They are moving her in less than 2 hours. The FBI won't even have agents on scene before she's gone. And even if they did, even if they believed me right away, even if they dropped everything to help the traffickers have someone inside law enforcement, they told me, they made sure I knew. One phone call to the wrong person and Zoe dies. Keith wanted to close the door, wanted to lock it and check on Holly and pretend this broken woman wasn't dragging violence back to his doorstep. He'd promised himself the day he buried Rachel that he was done. No more missions, no more killing, no more being the thing that Rachel had always feared lived inside him. Just pancakes on Sunday and helping with homework and fixing leaky pipes for $70 an hour. A simple life, a safe life. The kind of life where 8-year-old girls grew up knowing their father would always come home. Veronica reached into her jacket pocket. Keith's hand moved instinctively to a weapon that wasn't there, but she just pulled out a phone, unlocked it with shaking fingers and held it up. The screen showed a photo of a little girl with dark hair and serious eyes. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the kind that came from a child who'd learned early that the world wasn't always safe. She wore a purple jacket and held a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. Keith looked at the photo and saw Holly. Different hair color, different face, but the same age. The same vulnerable innocence that could be shattered so easily by men who saw children as commodities. Veronica's voice broke. That's Zoe. That's my baby. She's all I have. Her father died when she was 3. It's just been us. I work 2 jobs to keep us fed. I teach her to be careful, to not talk to strangers, to stay close to me. But it didn't matter. They grabbed us in broad daylight, right outside our building. Nobody stopped them. Nobody helped. Now she's in a container in that warehouse, and I'm standing on your doorstep begging a stranger to save her because I have nowhere else to turn. Keith's throat tightened. He thought about the day Holly was born, the way the nurse had placed her in his arms, and he'd felt something shift in his chest, some fundamental rewiring of priority. He'd been deployed when Rachel went into labor. Made it back 18 hours after delivery. Rachel had been exhausted and beautiful, and had looked at him with eyes that held both forgiveness and warning. You missed it. Don't miss the rest. He'd missed so much. First steps, first words. Birthdays spent on the other side of the world. Parent-teacher conferences attended by Rachel alone while Keith was in some compound in Kandahar or some village in Yemen or some nowhere place where men killed each other over things that stopped mattering the moment he held his daughter. Then Rachel died, and suddenly Keith had been there for everything. Every scraped knee, every nightmare, every morning and every night. He'd learned to braid hair and pack lunches and help with math homework. He'd learned to be present in ways he'd never managed when Rachel was alive. And now this woman was asking him to risk all of that, to risk leaving Holly orphaned, to risk becoming the weapon he'd locked away. But the alternative was letting a 9-year-old girl disappear into a system that would destroy her, letting Veronica face this alone, letting fear and self-preservation win. Keith looked at the photo one more time, tried to imagine walking away, going back to bed, waking up tomorrow and reading the news about a missing child and knowing he could have helped, knowing he'd chosen his own safety over a child's life. The thought made him sick. Veronica seemed to sense his hesitation. Her next words came out barely above a whisper, but they hit with the force of a battering ram. If it was your daughter, would you wait for the police? The question cut through everything. The answer was obvious, immediate, absolute. If someone took Holly, Keith would burn the world to get her back. He wouldn't wait for authorities or proper channels or anyone's permission. He'd do whatever it took, legal or not, moral or not, because she was his daughter, and that meant everything else was negotiable. Keith felt the last of his resistance crumble. He'd known from the moment Veronica said the word daughter that he was going to help. Everything else had just been him trying to talk himself out of what he already knew he had to do. He started to speak when a small voice cut through the darkness behind him. "Daddy." Keith's heart stopped. He turned. Holly stood in the hallway in her unicorn pajamas, the ones with purple horns and rainbow manes. Her hair was mussed from sleep, one side sticking up in a way that would have made Rachel laugh. She rubbed her eyes with small fists, looking confused and scared. The sight of her punched the air from Keith's lungs the way it always did. She looked so small, so breakable, so completely dependent on him to keep the world's ugliness away from her. Keith moved toward her, voice soft. "Hey, sweetheart, what are you doing up?" Holly looked past him to where Veronica stood in the doorway. Her eyes went wide. Even at 8 years old, Holly knew what violence looked like. She'd learned it the hard way, watching her mother's casket lowered into the ground, understanding that the world could take people away without warning. "Who's that lady? Why is she bleeding?" Keith crouched down, putting himself at Holly's eye level. He kept his voice calm, steady, the same tone he used when Holly had nightmares about Rachel. "This lady needs some help. She got hurt. I'm just talking to her about what to do." Holly looked at Veronica for a long moment. Something passed between them, some recognition that Keith couldn't quite name. Then Holly asked the question that destroyed his last defense. "Daddy, what would Mom do?" The words hit Keith like a sniper round. Clean, precise, devastating. Rachel's voice echoed in his memory. They'd been arguing about his re-enlistment. Holly had been 5, playing in the next room, and Rachel had looked at him with those steady brown eyes that saw through every defense he'd ever built. "We save people, Keith. That's what makes us human. But you have to decide what kind of saving matters more. The kind that happens on the other side of the world, or the kind that happens when you're here every single day for your daughter." He'd chosen wrong. He'd taken the deployment. 3 months later, Rachel was dead. But right now, in this moment, the two kinds of saving weren't separate. They were the same. Holly was safe in their home. Veronica's daughter wasn't. And Holly was asking what Rachel would do because Holly knew the answer. Rachel would have invited Veronica inside, would have cleaned her wounds, would have called every authority, every resource, every connection until that little girl was safe. Rachel had believed in saving people and doing the hard thing and being the person who stepped up when everyone else stepped back. Keith closed his eyes, felt Rachel's presence like a hand on his shoulder, heard her voice clear as the day she'd said it. "That's what makes us human." He opened his eyes and looked at his daughter, saw Rachel's moral clarity reflected back at him. "Go back to bed, sweetheart. I'll be there in a minute to tuck you in." Holly hesitated. She looked at Veronica again, then back at Keith. Something in her 8-year-old face looked suddenly older, wiser, like she understood more than she should. "Are you going to help her?" Keith felt his throat tighten. "Yes." "Good." Holly turned and padded back down the hallway, stopped at her doorway and looked back. "Be careful, Daddy. I need you to come home." The words were a knife in his chest. "I will, baby. I promise." Holly disappeared into her room. Keith heard the soft sound of her climbing back into bed, the rustle of covers. He stayed crouched in the hallway for a moment, letting the weight of what he was about to do settle over him. Then he stood and turned back to Veronica. His jaw was tight enough to ache. "How many men?" Veronica's eyes went wide with something between hope and disbelief. "You'll help." "How many? A 6 that I saw, maybe more." "They have guns. Pistols on their hips. I saw 2 with bigger weapons, the kind with straps." "Rifles." Keith's mind was already running calculations. 6 armed men minimum. Unknown layout. Hostage scenario with a child's life on the line. 2 hours until they moved her. It was a suicide mission if handled wrong. It was also exactly the kind of mission he'd trained 15 years to execute. "I need 10 minutes. Wait here." Keith didn't wait for a response. He walked back through the house past Holly's room, where he could hear her breathing, steadying back into sleep, into his bedroom. The closet smelled like cedar and old memories. He pushed aside winter coats until his hands found the lockbox in the back corner. 4 digits. Rachel's birthday. His fingers remembered the combination, even though he had sworn never to open this box again. The Sig Sauer P26 sat in its foam cradle like a sleeping snake. Standard seal sidearm, 15-round magazine. Keith had carried this weapon through 17 countries. had fired it in anger more times than he could count, had cleaned it every night because his life depended on it functioning perfectly every single time. He lifted it. The weight was familiar, comfortable in a way that made him hate himself a little. His hands moved through the motions without conscious thought. Press check the chamber, verify it was empty, load a magazine, chamber around, 15 plus 1. He found 3 more magazines in the box, 60 rounds total. Probably not enough. Definitely more than he wanted to use. The tactical vest was at the bottom of the closet. Black level 3, a soft armor with magazine pouches. Keith pulled it on over his t-shirt. It fit looser than it used to. He'd lost muscle mass, stopped the intense training regimen the teams required. His body had softened into civilian life, even as his skills stayed sharp through muscle memory. Beneath the vest, Keith found the photographs he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Rachel in her wedding dress, laughing at something he'd said. Rachel in the hospital, holding newborn Holly with an expression of pure love and exhaustion. Rachel at Holly's 5th birthday party, wearing a paper crown and chocolate frosting on her nose. Rachel alive. Rachel whole. Rachel never knowing that Keith would fail to protect her when it mattered most. He shoved the photos back into the box, forced the lid closed, sealed the memories away because if he let himself feel them right now, he'd never make it out the door. In the bathroom, Keith looked at himself in the mirror. The man staring back had Rachel's death carved into every line of his face. 3 years of grief and guilt and trying to be the father Holly deserved. But underneath that, the seal was still there. Cold, efficient, ready to do terrible things for reasons he told himself were right. He grabbed a black jacket to cover the vest and the gun, walked back to the front door where Veronica waited, hope and fear fighting for control of her expression. Keith's voice came out flat, mission-focused. "I'll get your daughter, but you need to do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that?" Veronica nodded so hard her whole body shook. "Give me your phone." She handed it over with trembling fingers. Keith pulled up her messages, found one from a number labeled Zoe, a text from 3 days ago. "Love you, Mom. See you after school." Keith typed, "Mom's friend is coming. Trust him." He sent it, then immediately deleted it from the sent folder. If the traffickers were monitoring the phone, they'd already seen it. But if they weren't, the deletion bought some security. If Veronica was telling the truth, they wouldn't be watching a 9-year-old's phone. If she was lying, Keith would know soon enough. "Layout of the warehouse. Tell me everything you remember." Veronica pulled in a shaking breath. Her words came faster now, more focused, like having a concrete plan was steadying her. Big open floor, maybe 100 feet by 100 feet. Metal shipping containers stacked in the center. They're using them like rooms, keeping people in them. Zoe's in the second row, blue door. I memorized it. Blue door with a rust stain on the bottom right corner. Keith absorbed the information. Where are the men? Oh, no. Office on the west side, that's where most of them stay. They play cards, watch TV. I think they're bored. They don't expect anyone to come. Cameras. Front entrance has cameras. I saw monitors in the office. But the loading dock and back is blind. That's how I got out. Keith nodded, sloppy security, overconfident, probably used to operating without resistance. That could work in his favor. How are they armed? Pistols on their hips. 2 had bigger guns. I don't know what kind, black, with straps. Any explosives, grenades, heavy weapons? Veronica shook her head. I don't know. I didn't see anything like that. Just the guns. Keith checked his watch. 2:38 a.m., less than 90 minutes until the traffickers moved Zoe. Tight timeline, no room for error. You are going to drive me there, park 2 blocks away, then you are going to find a payphone and call 911. Tell them you heard gunshots at the textile mill on Hancock Street. Tell them officer needs assistance. That code gets immediate response. Veronica's face went pale. But you said not to call the police. You said they have someone inside. They do, but that doesn't mean police shouldn't come. We just need to control when and how. I'll be in and out before they arrive. The police response will force the traffickers to scatter. Makes it harder for them to regroup. Keith pulled on the jacket, zipped it up to hide the vest. Checked his watch again. We need to move now. Veronica stumbled toward an old Honda parked across the street. Keith followed every instinct, screaming that this was wrong. that he was making the same mistake he'd made in Syria, that he was choosing violence over being there for Holly. But what choice did he have? A 9-year-old girl was trapped in a shipping container somewhere in Portland, waiting for men who saw her as inventory. If Keith did nothing, he'd spend the rest of his life knowing he could have saved her, that he'd let another child lose what Holly had lost. That's what makes us human. They drove in silence through empty streets. Portland at night looked like a different city. Streetlights threw long shadows. The Willamette River reflected moon and bridge lights in patterns that looked almost peaceful. Keith rolled down the window, letting cold October air sharpen his focus. His right shoulder ached where the insurgent's knife had found him in Kabul. His ribs remembered the IED blast in Helmand. His hands knew exactly how to kill quickly and quietly. He'd spent 15 years becoming a weapon, 3 years trying to forget. Now he was remembering. Veronica drove poorly, hands shaking on the wheel, eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Keith watched her carefully, looking for tells, inconsistencies, signs that this was something other than what she claimed. She seemed genuinely terrified, but Keith had seen good actors before. Taliban who could cry on command, informants who could lie through enhanced interrogation. The human capacity for deception was endless. He decided to test her. "How long have you lived in Portland?" Veronica glanced at him, surprised by the question. 3 years. We moved here after Zoe's father died. Wanted a fresh start. "Where'd you move from?" "Sacramento. That's where Zoe was born." Keith filed the information away. "What do you do for work?" "I'm a waitress. Breakfast shift at Bernie's Diner on Morrison Street. And I clean houses 3 days a week." Her voice caught. "I know it's not much. I know we're not important. But Zoe is everything to me. She's smart, gets straight A's, wants to be a veterinarian. She loves animals, has this way of making every stray cat in the neighborhood trust her." The details were good, specific, the kind of thing a real mother would know. But Keith had been deceived by a specificity before. "The men who took you, did they say anything? Give any indication of who they work for?" Veronica's hands tightened on the wheel. "They spoke Spanish sometimes. I don't speak it well, but I caught a few words. Something about a shipment, about moving product. They treated us like we weren't human, like we were just things." Keith's jaw tightened. He'd seen trafficking operations up close during his time in JSOC. The casual cruelty, the complete dehumanization. It was one of the few things that could still make him feel something other than numbness. "The man who got careless, the one who let you escape. What happened?" Veronica pulled in a breath. "He opened the container to bring me food, a sandwich and water, but his phone rang and he turned away to answer what, left the door open. I ran. Didn't think, didn't plan, just ran." "He didn't chase you." "He did. I heard him yelling, but I knew the area better than he did. There's a parking garage 2 blocks from the warehouse. I hid between cars until I heard him give up. Then I walked until I found your street." The story held together, but Keith noticed something odd. When Veronica talked about escaping, when she described running, her breathing didn't change. No sign of the residual adrenaline that should still be flooding her system. No physical markers of recent extreme stress. He looked at her wrists. In the light from passing street lamps, he could see faint marks. Red, abraded, consistent with zip tie restraints. But the pattern was wrong. The marks were too even, too uniform. Zip ties cut in unpredictable ways when someone struggled. They left irregular marks deeper in some spots than others. Veronica's marks looked almost deliberate, controlled. Keith filed that observation away. Didn't mention it. Kept his face neutral. Maybe he was being paranoid. Maybe 3 years away from the teams had made him see threats where none existed. Or maybe Veronica was lying about something. He'd find out soon enough. The textile mill rose against the skyline like a tombstone. 6 stories of dark windows and corrugated metal. Most of the complex had been abandoned for a decade, leaving it to transients and drug dealers, and now apparently human traffickers. The kind of place where screams went unnoticed, and bodies could disappear without anyone asking questions. Veronica parked 2 blocks north exactly like Keith had instructed. She killed the engine and turned to him with desperate eyes. "Bring her back, please." Keith didn't answer. He was already gone, sliding into the operational mindset that had kept him alive through 200 missions. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. Doubt was a death sentence. Right now, he wasn't Keith Brennan, father of an 8-year-old girl who made Sunday pancakes. He was Petty Officer First Class Brennan, and he had a target to neutralize. He opened the door, stepped out into the October cold. The weight of the Sig Sauer under his jacket was oddly comforting. Familiar, like meeting an old friend he'd tried to forget. Veronica called out softly as he started to walk away. Keith. He stopped, looked back. Her eyes were strange, too clear, too focused. The terror from earlier had shifted into something else, something harder. I'm sorry for what's about to happen. Keith's hand moved to his weapon. What does that mean? Veronica just shook her head. Get my daughter back. That's all that matters. Then she drove away, taillights disappearing around the corner, leaving Keith alone on an empty street at 3:17 in the morning with a gun in his jacket and the growing certainty that he'd just walked into something much more complicated than a simple rescue. He stood there for 10 seconds running through options. Walk away, call the police himself, recon the area, and reassess. But Zoe was in there. Real or not legitimate victim or bait that little girl existed. Keith had seen her photo, had read the fear in Veronica's eyes, manufactured or not. Whatever game was being played, that child was a piece on the board. And Keith had never been good at leaving pieces behind. He moved toward the warehouse. The approach took 12 minutes. Keith used every skill the teams had drilled into him. Moved from shadow to shadow. Used terrain and structures for cover. Stay off the skyline. Trust your instincts. The loading dock was exactly where Veronica had said. Metal door hanging open 6 inches. No guards visible from this angle. Either sloppy security or a trap. Keith crouched behind a rusted forklift and watched. Waited. Breathed. 3 minutes passed. 4. Keith's legs burned from the crouch, but he didn't move. Patience was the SEAL's greatest weapon. Most men died because they moved too soon, because they trusted speed over caution. Then he saw it. Orange glow of a cigarette near the northwest corner. A guard doing a lazy patrol, more interested in his smoke than his job. Keith marked the pattern. 30 seconds to the corner. 45-second pause while he smoked. 30 seconds back. Predictable. Fatal. Keith moved during the guard's pause at the corner. Closed 50 meters in absolute silence, finding clear ground between debris and trash. He'd crossed 40 meters before the guard even started to turn around. When the man did turn, Keith was already inside his range. One hand clamped over the guard's mouth. The other arm snaked around his neck, applying pressure to the carotid arteries. Blood choke. Clean. Quiet. Effective. The guard struggled for 7 seconds. Keith counted them. Felt the man's body go from rigid resistance to limp surrender. He lowered the guard to the ground, checked for a pulse. Still alive. Unconscious, but breathing. Keith pulled zip ties from his vest pocket. Secured the man's wrists behind his back. Ankles together. Used the guard's own shirt as a gag, torn into strips and tied tight enough to prevent screaming, but loose enough to allow breathing. 1 down. Unknown number remaining. Keith dragged the guard behind a dumpster. Took the man's pistol, a Glock 19, and dropped the magazine. Ejected the chambered round. Threw the gun into a storm drain 20 feet away. Pocketed the ammunition. Then he moved to the loading dock door. The metal screeched slightly as he pulled it open wider. Keith froze. Listened. No reaction from inside. He slipped through the gap, let his eyes adjust to the deeper darkness. The warehouse floor opened up massive and empty, exactly like Veronica had described. Metal shipping containers stacked in the center like a maze. Maybe 15 containers total, arranged in rough rows. Each one could hold a dozen people. Or 1 child. Keith moved along the wall using container shadows for cover. His breathing was steady, controlled. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The same rhythm he'd learned at Bodhist, the same pattern that had carried him through Hell Week and every operation since. He could hear voices now, coming from the West Side office, just like Veronica had said. Male voices, laughing about something, and the sound made Keith's blood run cold. These men were trafficking children and they were laughing. He'd killed for less in the Middle East. Much less. The blue container was in the second row. 40 feet from the office. Keith approached low and fast, pressing his ear to the metal door. Listened. Nothing. No sound. No movement. The door was secured with a heavy padlock. Keith pulled the bolt cutters he'd grabbed from his big truck, positioned them carefully, and squeezed. The sound of shearing metal seemed impossibly loud in the silence. He froze, waited, counted to 30. No reaction from the office. The laughter continued, oblivious. Keith opened the door slowly, wincing at the scrape of metal on metal. The container was dark inside. He pulled his tactical flashlight, held it alongside his weapon, and thumbed it on. A small figure huddled in the far corner. Arms wrapped around knees. Dark hair. Purple jacket. Zoe. She looked up at him with eyes too old for a 9-year-old face. Eyes that had seen things no child should see. But she didn't scream. Didn't panic. Just watched him with the kind of wary assessment Keith had seen in rescued hostages before. Survivor's eyes. Keith kept his voice to a whisper. Zoe, your mom sent me. We need to go right now. Can you walk? The girl nodded slowly, stood on shaking legs. She was wearing the same clothes from the photo, purple jacket over jeans. But there were stains now, dirt and something darker. Her face was tear-streaked, but her eyes were sharp. Alert. This girl had been through hell, but she hadn't broken. Well, stay behind me. If I tell you to run, you run. Understand? Zoe nodded again. No questions, no hesitation. Just immediate compliance. Keith felt something crack in his chest. This was Holly's age. This was someone's daughter. Someone's entire world. He led her back along the path he'd taken, moving slow, careful. They were 20 feet from the loading dock when a door slammed somewhere behind them. The voices from the office suddenly changed. Sharp. Alert. Someone shouted in Spanish. Then English. The container's open. Keith pushed Zoe toward the loading dock. Go. Run to the street. Find the blue Honda 2 blocks north. Get in and lock the doors. Go now. Zoe ran, fast and quiet and smart enough not to look back. Keith turned toward the voices, pulled the Sig Sauer from his jacket. He didn't want to shoot, didn't want to become that person again. But men were spilling out of the office now, armed, angry, hunting. He counted 4. No, 5. One of them shouted something and pointed toward Zoe's retreating form. Another raised a pistol. Keith fired twice. Center mass shots, training taking over. The man went down. Keith didn't watch where he fell, was already moving, already targeting the next threat. The other men scattered, returning fire. Bullets sparked off metal containers around Keith's head. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Keith dropped behind a forklift. His heart hammered, but his hands stayed steady. These weren't soldiers. They moved wrong, exposed themselves wrong, fired wildly without proper aim or fire discipline. Keith was 2 more down with the controlled shots. Shoulder wounds, leg wounds, disabling but not fatal. 3 down, 2 retreating. Then Keith heard it. Sirens, still distant but getting closer. Veronica must have made the call, or the gunfire had drawn attention. Either way, the cavalry was coming. That changed the equation. Keith couldn't be here when police arrived. Too many questions, too much exposure. He'd saved Zoe. That was the objective. Time to extract. He started to move toward the loading dock when a voice stopped him cold. Keith Brennan. The voice came from the office doorway. Calm, controlled. Nothing like the panicked shouts of the other men. A figure stepped out. Tall, lean, moving with the kind of precise economy that marked military training. He wasn't carrying a pistol. He held an AR-15, low and ready, professional grip. You don't remember me, but I remember you. Keith said nothing. His mind raced through faces, deployments, missions, trying to place this voice, this threat. The man took another step forward. Light from a security lamp caught his face. Hispanic, mid-30s, scar running along his jawline, eyes that held the flat affect of someone who'd seen too much death. 2018. Tikrit. Your team hit a weapons market. My brother was there. Wrong place, wrong time. You shot him in the street. The memory surfaced. Night raid. Bad intelligence. Too many civilians in the kill zone. Keith's team had taken fire from a rooftop. He'd returned fire. Multiple targets engaged. A man had fallen in the street. Later, the after-action report had noted civilian casualties. 17 dead, 5 of them non-combatants. Wrong place, wrong time. One of the costs of war that Keith had learned to live with. Until Rachel died and suddenly every cost seemed too high. Luis Reyes, the man said. My brother's name was Carlos, 23 years old, engaged to be married, and you killed him for being in the wrong place. Keith's finger tightened on the SIG's trigger. I didn't know. You didn't care. Luis's voice was flat, dead. None of you cared. You came into our countries, kicked down our doors, killed our families, and called it service. Well, I'm here to collect payment. The sirens were getting closer. Maybe a minute out. Keith needed to move, needed to extract. But Luis had the superior position, superior firepower, and the kind of calm that came from planning this moment for a long time. By trafficking children. Keith's voice came out harder than he intended. By making me kill again, that's your revenge. No. Luis smiled. It was the cruelest thing Keith had ever seen. The revenge is making you realize you can't stop, that you'll always be what Rachel feared you were, a weapon that can't stop pulling its trigger. Keith's blood went cold. What did you say? Veronica works for me, as for 6 months. Took us that long to find you. Another 3 months to set this up. Her daughter really is in that container. Was. You sent her running. Good job. But you're the real target, Keith. Always were. The world tilted. Veronica had played him. The bruises, the fear, the desperate mother act. All of it crafted to draw him out, to make him pick up a gun, to prove that he couldn't escape what he was. You're lying. Maybe. Luis shrugged. Maybe Veronica was telling the truth about everything. Maybe her daughter really was in danger. Or maybe she's safe at home, eating breakfast, wondering where mom went. You'll never know. The sirens were 30 seconds out. Keith could see flashing lights reflecting off buildings outside. Luis raised the AR slightly. Here's your choice. You can die here and Holly grows up an orphan. Or you can put down that gun and walk away. I'll let you leave. Go home. Never look back. All you have to do is leave Zoe behind. Let us collect her. Prove you care more about your kid than someone else's. Keith looked at the loading dock. Zoe was gone, hopefully in Veronica's car, hopefully safe. But Luis's words planted doubt. What if it was all a lie? What if Zoe was just another pawn, another layer of deception? What if Keith had just traded his soul for nothing? His hand tightened on the SIG. He thought about Holly asleep in her unicorn pajamas, about the promise he'd made to always come home, about Rachel's voice asking what kind of saving mattered more. The answer was supposed to be simple. His daughter. Always his daughter. But if he walked away now, if he left without knowing the truth, he'd become something worse than dead. He'd become the man who let a child suffer to save himself. The man Rachel would have been ashamed to know. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. I'm walking out, and Keith said slowly, and if Zoe isn't safe, I'm coming back. Luis's expression hardened. Wrong answer. Everything happened fast. Luis raised the AR. Keith dove left, firing as he moved. His first 2 shots went wide, adrenaline throwing his aim. Luis's rifle barked rounds, chewing into the concrete where Keith had been standing. Keith rolled behind a container, breathing hard. Pain flared in his right shoulder. Not a direct hit. Ricochet. Shrapnel. Blood warm and spreading. But he was alive. For now. The sirens were right outside. Blue and red lights flashed through windows. Keith heard car doors slamming, police radios crackling, authoritative voices shouting commands. Luis swore in Spanish, fired 3 more rounds at Keith's position, then retreated back toward the office. 30 seconds later, Keith heard an engine roar to life. A loading bay door in the north wall rolled open. Headlights swept across the warehouse as a van peeled out into the night. Gone. Keith waited until the sound faded. Then he stumbled toward the loading dock. His shoulders screamed with every movement. Blood soaked through his jacket. But he was alive. More importantly, Luis was gone. The confrontation was over. For now, police were coming through the front entrance. Keith could hear them clearing rooms, calling out locations, establishing perimeter. Professional. organized. He had maybe 90 seconds before they reached the warehouse floor. He slipped out the loading dock back into the October cold, moved away from the building using shadows and parked cars for cover. His shoulder was on fire, but he kept moving. Couldn't stop. Couldn't let himself get caught in the police net. 2 blocks, 3. His vision was starting to swim. Blood loss or shock or both. Keith leaned against a chain-link fence, gasping, pulled out his phone with shaking hands. Texted Veronica Zoe, save 30 seconds. No response. 60 seconds. Still nothing. Keith felt something cold settle in his stomach. What if Luis had been telling the truth? What if Veronica had taken Zoe and disappeared? What if this whole thing had been exactly what Luis said? An elaborate trap with no real rescue, just Keith proving he couldn't escape what he was. His phone buzzed. One word. Yes. Keith stared at the text. Wanted to believe it. Wanted to trust that Zoe was safe, that Veronica was real, that he hadn't just thrown away everything for nothing. But doubt had taken root. Luis's words echoed in his head. You'll never know. Keith pushed off the fence, kept moving, made it back to his truck on muscle memory and willpower. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and pain. He parked in the driveway at 4:47 a.m. The sky was starting to lighten. Holly would be waking up in an hour, wondering where he'd gone. He had to clean up, had to hide the damage, had to become her father again instead of the weapon he'd just proven he still was. Keith stumbled into the house, straight to the bathroom, locked the door, stripped off his jacket and shirt. The wound in his shoulder was ugly, jagged, deep enough to scar, but not deep enough to hit bone or major vessels. Lucky, he cleaned it with hydrogen peroxide that made him bite down on a towel to keep from screaming, bandaged it with gauze and medical tape, pulled on a clean shirt that would hide the damage. When he opened the bathroom door, Holly was standing in the hallway. Keith's heart stopped. Holly's voice was small, scared. Daddy, where did you go? Keith's throat tightened. He knelt down, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, and pulled his daughter into a hug. She felt so small against him, so precious, so completely unaware of how close she'd come to losing him. I had to help someone. The lady with the hurt face. Holly pulled back, looking at his face with those 2 wise eyes she'd inherited from Rachel. Did you break your promise? Keith thought about Luis, about the gun in his hand, about the men he'd shot and the violence he'd sworn to leave behind. Yeah, baby, I did. Holly was quiet for a long moment. Then she hugged him tighter and whispered, Mom would have wanted you to help her. I know she would. Keith closed his eyes, held his daughter, tried not to think about how close he'd come to making her an orphan, tried not to think about Luis's words or Veronica's strange goodbye or the doubt that was eating him alive. I'm sorry for leaving, for breaking the promise. Holly's voice was muffled against his chest. It's okay, Daddy. You came back. That's what matters. Keith held her until his shoulder couldn't take it anymore, until the pain forced him to let go. Then he walked Holly back to her room, tucked her in, sat on the edge of her bed until she fell back asleep. Morning light was filtering through the curtains when Keith finally stood. His shoulder throbbed. His mind raced with questions that had no answers. His hands remembered the weight of the Sig Sauer, the recoil, the moment when muscle memory had taken over and turned him back into the thing he'd tried to leave behind. He walked to his room, pulled the gun from his jacket, looked at it for a long moment. The metal was still warm, still carried the smell of gunpowder, still represented everything he'd promised Rachel he'd never be again. Keith walked back to the closet, opened the lockbox, put the Sig Sauer back in its foam cradle, closed the lid, spun the combination lock. Then he walked to the kitchen and started making pancakes. Because that's what fathers did. They made breakfast, they showed up. They pretended the world was safe even when they knew it wasn't. Outside Portland woke up to Tuesday morning. Somewhere Luis Reyes was planning his next move. Somewhere Veronica was with her daughter, real rescue or elaborate fiction. Somewhere police were investigating a shootout at an abandoned warehouse and finding more questions than answers. But here in this small house with its secondhand furniture and walls that smelled like Sunday pancakes any day of the week, Keith Brennan was trying to believe that what he'd done had mattered, that Zoe was safe, that breaking his promise had been worth it. He flipped pancakes and watched them bubble and turn golden brown. Holly would wake up in 30 minutes. She'd come into the kitchen rubbing sleep from her eyes. She'd ask if the lady was okay. Keith would tell her yes, would make himself believe it. Because the alternative that Luis had been right, that Keith had proven he couldn't escape what he was, that he'd risked everything for a lie, was too terrible to accept. The pancakes were ready when Holly appeared in the doorway. She climbed onto her chair at the kitchen table and looked at Keith with those steady eyes. The lady's daughter. Did you save her? Keith set the plate down, forced himself to smile. Yes, baby, she's safe. Holly smiled back, reached for the syrup. Good, that's what heroes do. Keith wanted to tell her he wasn't a hero, that heroes didn't shoot people, didn't break promises, didn't carry the weight of 17 dead civilians from a raid gone wrong. Heroes were supposed to save people without becoming monsters in the process. But Holly was 8 years old and she'd already lost her mother. She deserved to believe her father was someone worth believing in. So Keith sat down across from her and ate pancakes and pretended that the blood on his shirt wasn't there, that the wound on his shoulder would heal without scars, that everything he'd done in the last 3 hours had been for something real, instead of a manipulation designed to prove he'd never escape his past. Holly chattered about school, about a project on the solar system, about how Jupiter had 79 moons, and wasn't that amazing? Keith listened and nodded and tried to focus on her voice instead of Luis's words echoing in his head. You'll never know. The wound took 11 days to stop bleeding through the bandages. Keith changed the dressing 3 times a day, locked in the bathroom while Holly ate breakfast or watched cartoons or did homework at the kitchen table. Each time he peeled back the gauze, he expected infection. Expected the angry red streaks that meant sepsis, that meant hospital, that meant questions he couldn't answer. The wound stayed clean. Small mercies. Holly asked about it once on day 3 when she'd walked into his room without knocking and caught him wincing as he pulled on a shirt. Her eyes had gone wide, focused on the white bandage stark against his skin. Keith had frozen, waited for the questions, waited for her to ask how he'd gotten hurt, why there was blood, what had really happened that night. Instead, Holly had walked over, stood on her tiptoes and kissed the bandage gently. Then she'd looked up at him with Rachel's eyes and whispered one word, brave. Then she'd left, hadn't mentioned it again. Keith didn't know if that made him a good father or a terrible one. Teaching his 8-year-old daughter to accept violence without explanation, to see wounds and call them bravery instead of recognizing them for what they were, evidence of promises broken of the man he'd sworn never to be again. The news coverage started on day 2. Local stations picked it up first. Shooting at abandoned textile mill. 3 men wounded in custody. Police investigating gang-related activity. No mention of trafficking. No mention of a missing child. No mention of Keith Brennan or a desperate rescue in the small hours of morning. Keith watched every broadcast, read every article, searched for patterns for truth, for anything that would tell him whether Zoe had been real or just another layer in Luis's elaborate revenge. The wounded men weren't talking. According to one report, they'd lawyered up, immediately refused to cooperate with investigators. 2 were deported within a week, immigration violations that conveniently removed them from the equation. The 3rd disappeared from county lockup on day 8, released on a technicality that made Keith's skin crawl. Someone had reach, someone had power, someone was cleaning up loose ends. Keith started carrying the Sig Sauer again. Not openly, not the way he had that night, but close. Holstered at the small of his back, hidden under loose shirts and jackets. He told himself it was temporary. Just until he knew whether Luis was done playing games. He told himself a lot of things that felt like lies. Work became mechanical. Keith showed up to job sites, fixed leaking pipes, replaced water heaters, charged $70 an hour, and barely heard the words coming out of his own mouth. Customers noticed. Mrs. Chen on Hawthorne asked if he was feeling all right, said he looked tired, offered him tea he didn't drink. Mr. Rodriguez on Division asked point blank if Keith was in some kind of trouble, said he had a cousin who was a lawyer if Keith needed help. Keith thanked them, declined, finished the jobs, went home. Holly noticed too. She'd gotten quiet, watchful, the way children do when they sense instability in their foundation. She didn't ask about the lady anymore. Didn't ask why Keith kept checking his phone, why he stood at the window some nights, staring out at the empty street, why he jumped slightly when the mail carrier knocked at noon. But her nightmares came back, the ones she'd had right after Rachel died. Keith would wake to her crying, would go to her room and hold her while she sobbed about monsters and losing people and being alone. He'd stroke her hair and promise he wasn't going anywhere, promise she was safe, promise lies that tasted like ash. Because the truth was, Keith didn't know if they were safe, didn't know if Luis was finished, didn't know if helping Veronica had been the right choice or the biggest mistake of his life. The uncertainty was acid eating through his chest. On day 14, Keith finally broke down and called a number he'd sworn never to use again. Commander Harris, his old CO, the man who'd tried to talk Keith out of leaving the teams, who'd kept the trident on his desk for 6 months, hoping Keith would come back for it. Harris answered on the third ring, voice gravelly suspicious. "Brennan, that you?" Keith's throat was tight. "Yeah, it's me." Silence. Then, "You calling to come back?" Because the answer's still yes. "We could use you." "Always could." "No, I need information. Trafficking network operating out of Portland. Textile mill on Hancock Street. There was a raid 2 weeks ago. 3 men wounded. I need to know if it was legitimate, if there was really a child involved." More silence. Keith could practically hear Harris's mind working, connecting dots, reading between lines. "You involved in that? Does it matter?" "It does if you're calling me." Harris's voice shifted, became harder, more official. "What aren't you telling me?" Keith closed his eyes, pressed his forehead against the kitchen wall. Holly was at school. The house was empty, except for ghosts. "I helped someone, or I thought I did. Now I don't know if it was real or if I got played. I need to know the truth." Harris was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was careful. "Brennan, if you're mixed up in something, you need to come in. Let us help. Don't try to handle this alone." "I'm not mixed up in anything. I'm just asking if you can find out whether a 9-year-old girl named Zoe Hayes was reported missing around October 20th. Portland area, that's all." "And if she wasn't?" Keith didn't have an answer for that. Harris sighed. "I'll make some calls. But Keith, if this comes back dirty, if you did something that's going to blow back on you, you call me immediately. Understand? Don't be stupid. Don't try to be a hero." "I'm not a hero. Never was." "That's not what your service record says." Keith hung up before Harris could say anything else. Stood in the kitchen, staring at his phone, wondering if he'd just made everything worse. Wondering if making that call had put Harris in danger, had given Luis another target, had started a chain reaction he couldn't stop. Wondering if paranoia was eating his brain, or if the threat was real. The answer came that night. Keith was making dinner pasta with jarred sauce because his cooking skills hadn't improved beyond breakfast food when Holly called from the living room. "Daddy, there's a car outside." Keith's hand went to the cig at his back. Pure instinct. He forced himself to slow down, to breathe, to walk calmly to the window instead of running. A blue sedan sat at the curb, engine running, windows tinted, no plates visible from this angle. Keith's heart hammered. He positioned himself between Holly and the window, kept his voice level. "Go to your room, baby. Lock the door. Don't come out until I tell you." Holly's eyes went wide. "Daddy." "Now, Holly." She ran. Keith heard her door slam, heard the lock click. Good girl, smart girl, Rachel's daughter. Keith pulled the cig, checked the chamber, moved to the front door. Every lesson from 20 years of training flooding back. Unknown vehicle, unknown occupants, unknown threat level. Assume hostile until proven otherwise. The car door opened. Veronica stepped out. Keith's finger moved off the trigger. Barely. She looked different. Clean, hair pulled back, no bruises, jeans and a sweatshirt that said Portland State across the front. Normal. Almost believable as the desperate mother from 2 weeks ago. Almost. Then the back door opened and Zoe climbed out. Purple jacket, dark hair, holding a piece of paper in both hands like it was precious. Keith's throat closed. Zoe was real. She existed. She was here, which meant everything else might be real too, or might be the next layer of Luis's game. Veronica approached slowly, hands visible, movements careful. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Zoe stood half hidden behind her mother, peeking around at Keith with those 2 old eyes. Keith kept the cig behind his back, kept his voice flat. What are you doing here? Veronica flinched at his tone. I came to say thank you and to explain. And explain what? How you lied, how you worked at it for Luis, how you used your daughter as bait to manipulate me into becoming a killer again. Veronica's face crumpled. It wasn't like that. Not completely. Luis did take Zoe. He did threaten to kill her. Everything I told you about being grabbed about the warehouse, about them moving her at 4 a.m., that was all true. But, but he also told me to bring you specifically, said if I didn't convince you to come, he'd kill Zoe anyway. He gave me the bruises himself, told me exactly what to say, coached me for 3 days on how to make you believe me. Keith's jaw tightened. Why? Why did Luis want me there? He said you killed his brother, said you needed to understand what it felt like to lose someone, to be helpless. He thought watching you choose between saving Zoe and protecting yourself would break something in you, prove you were still the weapon you used to be. And you went along with it. He had my daughter. Veronica's voice broke. What would you have done if someone had Holly and told you to lie, to manipulate, to become something you hated? Would you have said no? Keith didn't answer because he knew the truth. He would have done anything, become anyone, destroyed whatever needed destroying to get Holly back. That's what Luis had counted on. That's what made the whole thing work. Veronica pulled in a shaking breath. But you saved her anyway. Even after Luis told you it might be a lie, even knowing you might die, you chose to get Zoe out. You didn't abandon her. That's not something I can walk away from without saying thank you. Zoe stepped forward, held out the folded paper. Keith took it, opened it. A child's drawing in crayon. Stick figure man in black holding hands with stick figure girl in purple. Behind them, the sun was rising. Above it, in careful block letters, thank you for saving me. Keith stared at the drawing, felt something crack in his chest. This was real. Zoe was real. The rescue had mattered, manipulation or not. Unless this was another layer, another law, another test. Luis's words echoed, you'll never know. Keith looked up at Veronica. Where's Luis now? Gone, Mexico probably. FBI is looking, but he covered his tracks. Changed his name, had documents ready, planned the whole thing for months. He's smart, careful. He'll come back. Maybe. Veronica's eyes were steady now. But we won't be here. My sister's in Denver, taking us in, new VU names, fresh at start. I just wanted you to know that what you did mattered, that Zoe's alive because you didn't give up on her. Keith wanted to believe her, wanted this to be closure, wanted the drawing in his hands to represent something good instead of another manipulation. But trust had become impossible. Veronica seemed to read his doubt. She pulled an envelope from her pocket, held it out. This is everything I know about Luis. Real name, last known contacts, places he mentioned. I wrote it down in case you needed it, in case he comes back. Keith took the envelope, didn't open it, wasn't sure if he ever would. Veronica looked at him for a long moment. Then she took Zoe's hand and walked back to the sedan. They drove away, didn't look back. Keith stood on his porch holding a child's drawing and an envelope full of information he wasn't sure was real. The cig was heavy against his spine. The wound in his shoulder ached. Holly was locked in her room, waiting for him to say it was safe. Nothing felt safe anymore. He went inside, unlocked Holly's door. She rushed out and hugged him tight enough to hurt his shoulder. He held her anyway, breathed in the strawberry shampoo scent of her hair, tried to believe that keeping her safe was enough, that being her father mattered more than hunting Luis, more than finding truth, more than revenge. That night, Keith made a decision. He couldn't undo what had happened. Couldn't erase the violence or the doubt or the wound that was scarring badly on his shoulder. But he could choose what happened next, could decide who he wanted to be for Holly, for himself, for Rachel's memory. The next morning, Keith started researching nonprofit organizations, mental health resources for veterans, support networks for domestic violence survivors. Within a week, he drafted a business plan. Within 2, he'd filed paperwork for a 501c3. Within 3, he'd found a small storefront downtown that the owner was willing to rent cheap because Keith was a veteran and the space had been empty for 8 months. Rachel's Haven opened 4 months after the night Veronica knocked on Keith's door. The sign outside was simple, clean, professional. Free counseling for veterans and domestic violence survivors. Hours listed below. A phone number for emergencies. Keith wasn't a licensed therapist, couldn't prescribe medication or provide official treatment, but he knew how to listen, knew how to sit with someone's pain without trying to fix it or explain it away, knew how to tell people that healing was possible because he was trying to heal too. The first client walked in on a Tuesday. Former Marine Iraq veteran couldn't hold a job because the nightmares made him unreliable. Keith sat with him for 2 hours. Didn't judge, didn't offer platitudes. Just listened and shared his own story, edited carefully to remove the classified parts. By the end of the conversation, the Marine was crying. By the end of the week, he'd agreed to see a real therapist Keith had connected him with. Small victories, more clients came, some veterans, some victims of abuse, some people who just needed someone to listen without agenda. Keith saw them all, built relationships, created community. Holly helped on Saturdays organizing donated clothes, serving coffee, chattering with visitors about school and Jupiter's 79 moons. She told everyone her dad was a hero. Keith always corrected her. He wasn't a hero. Heroes didn't carry scars from killing people. Heroes didn't wake up wondering if they had been manipulated. Heroes didn't keep a loaded weapon within reach because they couldn't trust the world anymore. But maybe being human was enough. Maybe showing up every day and trying to help was its own kind of heroism. 6 months after opening, Keith got a letter. No return address. Postmarked from Guadalajara. Inside was a single photograph. Luis Reyes standing in what looked like a plaza, holding a beer, smiling at the camera. On the back, in careful script, your move seal. Keith looked at the photo for a long time. Felt the old anger rising, the instinct to hunt to finish what had started to prove he could still be the weapon if needed. Then he walked to the shredder behind his desk at Rachel's Haven, fed the photo through, watched it turn to strips of nothing. Luis wanted him to be a weapon, wanted to prove Keith couldn't change, couldn't be anything but a killer dressed in civilian clothes. But Keith knew something Luis didn't. Revenge was easy. Violence was easy. What was hard was choosing peace every single day. Choosing to be the father Holly needed instead of the soldier Luis remembered. The strips of photograph curled in the wastebasket. Keith pulled out his phone, sent Commander Harris a text. Thanks for checking. I'm good. Don't need anything else. Harris replied immediately. You sure offer still stands if you want back in. Keith typed, I'm where I need to be. Then he put the phone away. That night, Holly asked if they could make pancakes for dinner. Keith said yes. They ate on the couch and watched a nature documentary about dolphins that made Holly laugh and ask 1,000 questions Keith couldn't answer. It was ordinary, simple, the kind of moment Rachel had died hoping Keith would have with their daughter. Later, after Holly was asleep, Keith stood in her doorway and watched her breathe. The scar on his shoulder ached in the cold. His hands remembered the weight of the Sig Sauer. His dreams still played Luis's voice saying, you'll never know. But standing there in the dark, listening to his daughter dream safe dreams in a safe house, Keith understood that this was the mission that mattered. Not the ones he'd run in 17 countries. Not the one in the warehouse. This one. Being here. Being present. Being enough. Outside Portland slept under November stars. Somewhere Luis was planning revenge that might never come. Somewhere Veronica and Zoe were building new lives under new names. Somewhere other fathers were losing their way. Other children were waiting for someone to save them. But here in this small house with secondhand furniture and walls that smelled like pancakes at strange hours, Keith Brennan had found what he'd been searching for since Rachel died. Not redemption, not forgiveness, just the simple, brutal, beautiful work of being human, of choosing again and again to be the man his daughter needed, the man Rachel had believed he could be. The guns stayed locked in the closet, the past stayed buried where it belonged, and Keith stayed here in the present building a future one small choice at a time. Because that's what saving people really meant. Not heroic acts in warehouses at dawn, but the 1,000 small decisions to be present, to be steady, to be there when it mattered most. To be human. Rachel's Haven had been open for 8 months when the first suicide call came in. 3 in the morning, Keith's emergency line buzzing against his nightstand. He answered before the second ring muscle memory from years of late-night alerts. The voice on the other end was young, male, shaking so hard the words barely formed. I can't do this anymore. I just wanted to tell someone Keith was already out of bed, pulling on jeans, grabbing keys. His voice stayed calm, steady, the same tone he'd used to talk down panicked teammates in firefights. Tell me your name. Marcus Webb. I came to the Haven last week. You gave me coffee and listened to me talk about Fallujah for 3 hours. Keith remembered. 24 years old, Army infantry, 2 tours, came home to find his girlfriend married to someone else, his job given away, his apartment rented to new tenants. Like the war had erased him from civilian life. Keith was in the truck, now phone on, speaker, driving toward the address Marcus had mumbled between sobs. Marcus, I need you to stay on the line. Keep talking to me. Tell me where you are right now. Burnside Bridge. I'm standing on the rail. It's so cold. I thought it would be harder, but it's not. It's easy, just one step. Keith's blood turned to ice. Burnside Bridge was 15 minutes away. Too far. Too long. He pushed the accelerator down, ran a red light, prayed Portland PD wasn't patrolling this route tonight. Marcus, listen to me. You came to the Haven because you wanted help. Part of you still wants to be here. Talk to that part. Tell me what it's saying. Silence. Wind on the line. The Willamette River flowing 200 feet below. Then Marcus's voice, barely a whisper, it's saying I'm tired, so tired, and I don't know how to stop being tired. Keith knew that exhaustion, had felt it after Rachel died, the bone-deep weariness that came from carrying weight no human was meant to carry alone. He'd stood at his own metaphorical bridge more than once, wondering if Holly would be better off with relatives who weren't broken, who didn't wake up screaming, who didn't see threats in every shadow. He'd never stepped off because Holly needed him. Not the perfect version, just him, present, trying. I know you're tired. I know it feels impossible. But Marcus, you survived Fallujah. You survived losing everything. You're still standing because some part of you is stronger than the tired part. I need you to find that strength right now, just for 5 more minutes. I don't have 5 minutes. I don't have anything. Keith was hitting 90 on an empty freeway. 10 minutes out, still too far. He needed to keep Marcus talking, needed to give him something to hold on to. You have me. Right now on this phone, you have someone who gives a damn whether you live or die. That's not nothing, Marcus. That matters. More silence. Then Marcus started talking, words spilling out like a wound finally opening, about the friends he'd lost, the children he'd failed to save, the translator who trusted him and died because of that trust, about coming home and finding that nobody wanted to hear these stories, that his pain made people uncomfortable, that he was supposed to just move on like the war was a bad dream instead of the thing that had rewritten his DNA. Keith listened, drove, watched the bridge come into view against the night sky. He pulled onto the shoulder, killed the engine, and saw Marcus standing on the rail, thin frame silhouetted against bridge lights. Phone to his ear, one hand gripping the cable, one foot already over empty air. Keith got out slowly, kept his voice calm on the phone. Marcus, I'm here. I can see you. Turn around. Let's talk face to face. Marcus turned. Even from 30 feet away, Keith could see the tears, the resignation, the absolute certainty that this was the only way out. Keith started walking, kept talking. I'm coming towards you, not to grab you, not to force anything, just to stand with you, because that's what we do. We stand with each other when it gets dark. He reached the rail, stood next to Marcus but didn't touch him, didn't make sudden moves. Just existed in the same space, 2 men on a bridge at 3 in the morning, both of them intimate with the weight of staying alive. Marcus's voice was raw. Why do you care? You don't even know me. Keith thought about Veronica, about Zoe, about the choice he'd made that night to become the weapon one more time, about the months since then trying to figure out what saving people actually meant. I know enough. I know you're hurting. I know you served. I know you came to the Haven looking for help because dying is easier than living, but you chose to live anyway. That takes courage most people will never understand. I'm not brave, I'm a coward. That's why I'm up here. Brave people feel fear and do the hard thing anyway. You're still breathing. That's the hardest thing. Every morning you wake up and choose to keep going, that's bravery. Keith gestured at the drop. This is the easy way out. You're better than easy. Marcus looked at him, really looked, and Keith saw the moment something shifted. Not fixed, not healed, just shifted enough to create doubt about the jump. What if it doesn't get better? What if I'm broken forever? Keith thought about Rachel, about the nightmares that still woke him, about the scar on his shoulder that would never fully fade, about learning to live with pieces missing, with damage that couldn't be repaired, only managed. Then you learn to live broken. You find people who understand broken. You build a life that works even when you're not whole. It's not the life you planned, but it's still a life. And Marcus, I promise you, there are people who want you in theirs. Keith held out his hand, not demanding, not forcing, just offering. Marcus stared at that hand for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. Then he took it. Keith pulled him back over the rail away from the edge onto solid ground. They sat on the bridge shoulder as dawn started to break. Marcus cried. Keith called the crisis team he'd built relationships with, waited until professionals arrived, made sure Marcus wasn't going to be alone. When Keith finally drove home, the sun was fully up. Holly was eating cereal at the kitchen table, already dressed for school. She looked at him with questions in her eyes but didn't ask them, just came over and hugged him tight. Keith held her and thought about Marcus, about how close the margin was between living and dying, about how saving people wasn't dramatic rescues in warehouses. It was showing up at 3 a.m. It was standing on bridges. It was being present in the moments when someone needed proof that their life mattered. That's what Rachel had meant. That's what Keith was finally starting to understand. Marcus came back to the Haven 3 days later, checked himself into inpatient treatment, started medication, found a therapist who specialized in combat trauma. 6 weeks later, he was working part-time at a bookstore and attending group sessions twice a week. Small victories, the only kind that mattered. Word spread about the Haven. More veterans came, more survivors of violence, more people carrying weight they couldn't name. Keith hired 2 part-time counselors using money from his Navy pension and donations from people who'd been helped. The storefront stayed modest, but the impact grew. Then Zoe started visiting. First time was in December, 9 months after the warehouse. Veronica called ahead, asked if it was okay. Keith said yes before he thought about whether it was smart or safe or opening old wounds. Zoe walked into the Haven on a Saturday morning when Holly was organizing the clothing donations. The 2 girls saw each other and something electric happened. Recognition, understanding, the unspoken knowledge that both had fathers who'd been willing to die for them. They disappeared into the back room, emerged an hour later with drawings they'd made together. Fantastic worlds where girls rode dragons and fought monsters and always won. Where fathers came home, where mothers stayed alive. After that, Zoe and Veronica visited once a month, sometimes more. Veronica helped with intake, used her experience to connect with domestic violence survivors in ways Keith never could. Zoe and Holly became something like sisters bonded by trauma they were too young to articulate, but old enough to recognize in each other. Keith watched them play and thought about Luis, about the photograph he'd shredded, about revenge that would never satisfy, that would only create more orphans, more broken families, more children, drawing pictures of the safety they deserved but rarely found. Luis had wanted Keith to prove he was still a weapon. Instead, Keith had built something that disarmed people, that made them whole, that saved lives without taking any. He wondered if Luis knew. If Luis was watching from Mexico, seeing the Haven grow, recognizing that his revenge had backfired, that Keith had taken the worst night of his civilian life and transformed it into something that mattered. Or maybe Luis didn't care. Maybe revenge was its own reward regardless of outcome. Keith decided it didn't matter. Luis was part of the past. The Haven was present. Holly and Zoe laughing in the back room was future. That's where Keith chose to live. January brought a woman named Sarah, mid-40s, professionally dressed, wedding ring still on her finger. She sat in Keith's office and said nothing for 20 minutes, just stared at her hands, at the ring, at the future she'd thought she was building before her husband's first backhand taught her that love and violence could coexist. Keith didn't push, didn't ask questions, just sat with her in the silence. Finally, Sarah spoke. Everyone says just leave, like it's simple. Like you can walk away from 15 years and 2 kids and a mortgage without destroying everything. Keith had heard this before. The complexity of abuse, the way it wrapped around every part of life until extraction felt impossible. You're right, it's not simple, but it's necessary. Sarah looked up. Her eyes were hard defensive. You don't know what you're asking. My husband is a cop. He has friends, resources. He's told me what happens if I try to leave, what he'll do to me, what he'll do to our kids. Keith felt something cold settle in his chest. Cop. That explained the confidence, the control, the certainty that he was untouchable. Have you documented the abuse? I've taken pictures, kept a journal, hidden copies in 3 different places. But what good does it do? He'll just say I'm crazy, making it up. His friends will back him up and I'll lose my kids in court. Keith pulled out a folder. Inside were contacts he'd built over 8 months. Lawyers who worked pro bono, shelters with locations kept confidential, even from law enforcement, therapists who specialized in helping abuse survivors navigate divorce. This is where you start, not alone, with people who know how to fight this fight. Sarah took the folder with shaking hands. What if it's not enough? What if he finds me anyway? Keith thought about the Sig Sauer locked in his closet, about the instinct to offer protection the way he'd protected people in 17 countries, about the line between helping and becoming the vigilante that would destroy everything he'd built. Then you call me, and we figure it out together. But Sarah, you can't live in fear of what might happen. You can only control what you do next. Sarah left with the folder. Keith didn't know if she'd use it, didn't know if she'd find the courage to live or if fear would keep her trapped for another 15 years. 2 weeks later, Sarah came back. Split lip, bruised ribs. Divorce papers filed. Restraining order issued. Kids safely placed with her sister in Seattle. She'd done the impossible thing. Keith helped her file for emergency relocation funds, connected her with a job placement service, gave her a burner phone with his number programmed in. Sarah hugged him before leaving, whispered, "Thank you for not trying to save me, for letting me save myself." The words stayed with Keith for days. That's what Rachel had been trying to teach him. Saving people wasn't doing it for them. It was giving them the tools and standing beside them while they did the hard work themselves. Spring came. Rachel's Haven celebrated its first anniversary. 63 people had walked through the doors. 47 were still engaged in treatment or support programs. 3 had died anyway, suicides Keith couldn't prevent, no matter how many 3 a.m. phone calls he answered. Those 3 haunted him. But 47 were alive. 47 had found something worth staying for. Holly organized the anniversary event, cupcakes and coffee and testimonials from people whose lives had changed. Marcus spoke about the bridge, about choosing to step back, about the bookstore job that had turned into assistant manager. Sarah talked about her kids in Seattle, about sleeping without fear, about remembering what it felt like to be human. Keith listened and felt Rachel's presence so strongly it hurt. She would have loved this, would have stood beside him, welcoming broken people and helping them stitch themselves back together. Maybe that's what she'd been doing all along, teaching him through absence what she couldn't teach through presence. That being a warrior wasn't about weapons. It was about wounds, about sitting with pain, about showing up when it would be easier to walk away. After the event, Keith found Zoe and Holly in the back room. They were making a scrapbook, filling it with photos and drawings from the past year. Zoe had drawn the warehouse, dark containers, a figure in black, a girl in purple running toward light. Under it, in careful letters, "The night I learned heroes are real." Keith's throat tightened. He knelt beside her. "I'm not a hero, Zoe." She looked at him with those 2 old eyes. "My mom says you are. She says you could have walked away, but you didn't. That makes you a hero." Holly chimed in, "That's what I keep telling him, but he never listens." Keith looked at these 2 girls, these mirrors of each other, these survivors of violence they should never have experienced. And he realized something fundamental. It didn't matter whether he thought he was a hero. What mattered was whether his actions created safety for people who had none, whether his choices made the world slightly less cruel, whether he showed up when showing up was hard. That night, after everyone left, after Holly was asleep, Keith sat in his office at the Haven and opened the envelope Veronica had given him months ago, the one with information about Luis. He'd kept it locked in his desk, unopened, a Pandora's box he'd been afraid to examine. Inside were names, addresses in Guadalajara, phone numbers, details about Luis's past, his military service, his brother Carlos, the trajectory of rage that had led to the warehouse. There was also a letter in Veronica's handwriting. I know you'll be tempted to hunt him, to finish what he started. But Keith, he wants that. He wants you to prove him right. The best revenge is building something he can never destroy. Be the man Rachel loved. Be the father Holly needs. Let Luis rot in his anger while you live in your peace. Keith read the letter 3 times. Then he fed the entire envelope through the shredder. Names, address, phone numbers, everything. Watched it turn to confetti. Luis was the past. The haven was present. Holly's future was what mattered. He locked the office and walked home through Portland streets. Spring air carried cherry blossoms. The city felt almost peaceful. Keith knew that was an illusion. Violence still happened. People still suffered. His work would never be finished. But tonight, walking under streetlights, with the taste of cupcakes still in his mouth, and the sound of Holly's laughter still echoing in his ears, Keith felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the naive kind. The kind that came from seeing evidence that staying alive mattered. That showing up created ripples. That choosing peace over revenge was its own kind of victory. He got home to find Holly still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper. Keith raised an eyebrow. It's late, sweetheart. What are you doing up? Holly held up the paper. It was a letter written in her careful 3rd-grade handwriting. Dear Mom, Dad is doing the thing you wanted. He's helping people. He's here every day. He's not scary anymore. I think you would be proud. I'm proud. Love, Holly. Keith's vision blurred. He sat down beside his daughter and pulled her close. Are you going to send it to Mom? Holly shook her head. I just wanted to tell her so she knows. They sat together in the quiet kitchen, holding each other, feeling Rachel's absence and presence simultaneously. She was gone. She was everywhere. She was in the Haven's mission, in Holly's moral clarity, in Keith's choice to build instead of destroy. That's what made them human. Not the absence of violence. The choice to create something better in its wake. Keith thought about Marcus on the bridge. Sarah's split lip. Zoe's drawing. The 47 lives still fighting. The 3 who'd lost. He thought about Luis in Mexico, probably planning something, probably watching, probably waiting for Keith to become the weapon again. But Keith was done playing that game. Done proving anything to anyone except the people who walked through the Haven's doors, looking for reasons to stay alive. He tucked Holly into bed, kissed her forehead, and stood in her doorway watching her breathe. The scar on his shoulder would never fade. The nightmares would probably never stop. The weight of 17 dead civilians in Tikrit would always be his to carry. But so would this, the haven, the lives saved, the choice to be present, the 1,000 small decisions to be better than his worst instincts. Rachel had said saving people made them human. Keith finally understood what she meant. It wasn't about heroic acts. It was about showing up, about being there, about proving through action that people mattered enough to fight for their right to exist. Outside, Portland slept under spring stars. Somewhere, Luis planned revenge that might never come. Somewhere, Sarah was learning to sleep without fear. Somewhere, Marcus was shelving books and counting it as victory. And here in this small house with its secondhand furniture and walls that smelled like anniversary cupcakes, Keith Brennan had finally become the man Rachel died believing he could be. Not a weapon, not a hero, just a father. Just a human being doing the simple, brutal, beautiful work of staying alive and helping others do the same. The gun stayed locked away. The past stayed buried. And Keith stayed present, building a future one saved life at a time.